A billionaire switched seats mid-flight to flirt with his mistress right in front of his wife, but when the pilot's voice suddenly echoed through the cabin, everything stopped. Passengers froze. Heads turned. Then her voice played through the speakers. What she revealed didn't just uncover his betrayal. It shattered everything he thought he controlled at 32,000 feet above the Pacific. The world felt strangely suspended in time. The hum of the engines thrummed softly beneath the stillness, a steady undertone easily ignored, but ever present like a heartbeat. Outside the oval windows, clouds sprawled endlessly, glowing, soft, surreal. But the atmosphere inside was anything but tranquil. The first-class cabin was the picture of high-end elegance. Buttery leather seats broader than some couches, dark wood partitions polished to a mirror shine, and a faint citrus scent lingering from the crew's detailed preparation. Crystal champagne flutes rested securely beside each seat. The soft clinking of silverware against porcelain barely disturbed the whispering conversations along the aisle. This wasn't silence, it was theater. Julian Bradford sat in seat 2A, legs extended, collar open just enough to seem laid back but calculated. The jet was technically leased through a front company under his luxury development empire, but he preferred to say it was his. It sounded better, especially around investors or women drawn to the idea of a man with his own jet. His slate gray suit jacket hung over the armrest, cufflinks catching light with every reach toward his whiskey. As always, it was neat, no ice to dilute. Everything about Julian's presence was curated, from the Omega timepiece on his wrist to the exact angle he leaned in his seat, relaxed but untouchable. Across the aisle, his wife Elise sat in 2B, staring out the window. Her fingers toyed with the rim of her untouched champagne. Her face still elegant, though the softness had given way to a tightness that hadn't been there a year ago. She'd dressed with care that morning. A blush cashmere set, minimal makeup, pearl studs Julian had gifted her on their 10th anniversary. She had packed a week in advance, excited for what he'd called a surprise getaway. A second honeymoon. It was their anniversary, after all. 20 years. 2 decades of weathering storms together, building a life most would envy, or so the press always claimed. Elise hadn't anticipated the hollowness that followed takeoff, nor the strange chill in Julian's demeanor. Since they'd boarded, he hadn't kissed her cheek. He hadn't even held her hand, just a distant nod. And now, not even eye contact. The weight of it settled over her like fog, silent, invasive. There had been distance before, sure, long meetings, lingering silences. But this was different. This was absence, sharpened by proximity. The kind of cold that didn't come from air conditioning, but from knowing someone you loved had already left the room, emotionally if not physically. Her eyes drifted toward the aisle, where the cabin crew moved with mechanical elegance. The lead attendant, a tall brunette with perfect posture, offered a polished smile as she paused beside her. "Would you care for anything else, Mrs. Bradford?" Elise returned a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "No, thank you." The attendant nodded and walked forward, but then paused, leaning slightly toward Julian. "May I freshen your drink, Mr. Bradford?" He looked up with a grin, holding out his empty glass. "Please, and let Morgan know I'll be joining her up front." Elise blinked. For a moment, just a moment, she'd wonder. Of course, it was always Morgan now. Her name, once meaningless, had slowly threaded its way into Elise's days. She'd started. She didn't have to turn. Elise had. Now mid-flight, Julian unbe. He didn't need to. The silence between them had dawned him. He strode down the aisle, past 5 occupied seats, each passenger pretend Elise remained perfectly still. She had Mr. Bradford. The pilot's voice cracked everyone FB. Then a pause. The seatbelt light blinked on. No turbulence. Not yet, anyway. But there was something different in the air. Elise could feel it. Her fingers brushed over the flap of her handbag. Inside, in a slim zippered pocket, was a flash drive. She had slipped it in just before boarding, carefully, discreetly. One of the attendants had passed it to the co-pilot while Julian was distracted. When Julian was distracted, she'd made the handoff. With a quiet confidence she hadn't felt in months. No drama. No theatrics, just precise timing. It had been instinctive, but deliberate, the culmination of weeks spent weighing courage against consequence. Now Julian was seated beside Morgan in the front row pod, laughing softly at something she'd whispered into his ear. Her long legs were stretched out beside his, and her champagne-colored wrap dress clung to her like liquid satin. Her laughter rose louder now, purposefully unrestrained. Julian didn't hush her. He basked in it. He wanted the attention. He needed the audience. His posture said it all. This is my life now. Get used to it. Elise shifted slightly in her seat, drawing in a slow, controlled breath. Across the aisle, her eyes caught those of a young man she vaguely recognized, an up-and-coming tech investor, maybe mid-30s. He offered her a brief, uncertain smile. It held a trace of sympathy. She returned it. Barely. She wasn't embarrassed. Not anymore. This wasn't shame. This was the overture. It was the first breath before a storm, the poised stillness before glass shatters. She had imagined this moment often, how it would feel, how it would look. But the reality was quieter, heavier. It didn't taste like triumph. It tasted like resolve. She picked up her champagne, took a measured sip, and set the glass down with the kind of poise that came from habit, not thought. The intercom crackled again. Then silence. Then another crackle. This time a faint click, less like a live mic and more like the start of a recording. Somewhere in the background Morgan giggled again, louder than necessary. "Julian, stop," she purred, just loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I'm not doing anything," he replied with a chuckle. "Oh, you're such a flirt," she said, her tones syrupy, performative. Elise blinked, slowly. Across the cabin, the older gentleman who'd been observing everything removed his glasses and set them on his tray table. The lights dimmed, just slightly, just enough. And then the intercom came alive again. But this time, it wasn't the pilot's voice. It was hers. Every head turned, every eye found her. Even Morgan's laughter cut off, like someone had pulled a switch. Elise's voice rang out, measured, unmistakably rehearsed, but unmistakably human. "Hello," she began. "If you're hearing this message, it means we." Julian froze, his whiskey glass tilted slightly in his grip. In fact, Elise's voice continued, smooth as silk. As of 48 hours ago, Julian Bradford no longer holds majority control of Bradford International Holdings. That transition occurred following a unanimous vote by the board. My board voted unanimously in favor of the transition. The murmurs began, low at first, uncertain, then sharper. Elise didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She just kept her eyes on the clouds. Morgan shifted in her seat. "What the hell is happening?" The message continued. "This aircraft is now registered to the Bradford Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to reversing the harm caused by men who build their empires on silence." Julian shot up, his chair jarring beneath him, whiskey glass slamming against the tray. "Turn that off," he barked toward the cabin crew. No one moved, not a soul. "Please enjoy the remainder of your flight," Elise's voice concluded. "And Julian, I hope she was worth it." Then, nothing. A silence so full it rang. It took nearly a minute before anyone breathed again. Julian turned to Morgan, his voice low and frantic. "Did you know about this?" She shook her head. Her mouth hung open slightly. No words came. Around them, passengers shifted in their seats. Some pulled out phones. Others just stared. Some at Elise, who sat with her hands calmly folded in her lap. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't seething. She looked free. At 32,000 feet over the Pacific, a man who thought he owned everything had just become a passenger, in every sense of the word. And the woman he left behind mid-flight? She had just taken off. Just like that. One selfish decision had detonated a chain reaction no one could reverse. But if you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Leave a comment, rate this story from 0 to 10, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because every voice matters. And every like helps us bring you more stories like this one. The sound of a fading heartbeat echoed in Elise's ears long after the message ended. Not a literal one, but the kind that lives inside a woman who spent too long silencing herself. For a moment, the cabin felt like it existed in two dimensions. One blanketed in stillness, and another where decades of betrayal pressed in like fog on the glass. No one moved. Julian remained by his seat, breathing hard, lips parted as if trying to choose between a laugh and a scream. He looked like a man expecting applause, only to find he'd walked into his own funeral. Morgan blinked. Once, twice. Then turned toward him, slowly folding her hands in her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. Meanwhile, Elise's mind drifted, not to her voice echoing from the speakers, not to the stunned faces around her, but far beyond all that. Past the tension, past the turbulence. Back to the moment it really began. Not the affair. That came later. No. The unraveling had started much earlier, like a single, quiet tug on a loose thread, until the entire sweater unraveled in silence. She was 22 when she met Julian. He was already a rising name in real estate. A self-made billionaire before turning 20. Arrogant and magnetic, with a smile that made other women instinctively adjust their wedding rings. He spotted her across the room at a charity benefit. She wasn't a guest. She was balancing a tray of hors d'oeuvres, working part-time for a catering company while finishing her MBA. He approached with a smug joke about shrimp cocktail. She shot back with a sarcastic remark about inflation. He liked that she didn't laugh just to flatter him. She liked that he didn't treat her like part of the scenery. Their first date happened 2 days later. By the end of that month, they were inseparable. The first time he introduced her as my future CEO, she believed him. He made her feel seen, as if her ambition didn't threaten him, but matched him. He spoke her language: vision, growth, numbers. Not just romance, but alignment. And for a young woman taught to apologize for her drive, that felt revolutionary. She reviewed contracts, offered branding input, sat in on interviews for key hires. She learned the real estate game alums. When they got married 3 years later, it was the kind of wedding magazines lived for, oceanfronts. And for a while, he meant it. But after his third major acquisition, something changed. The E-lists. Her thoughts became internal checklists. At first, she didn't push back. She understood the pressure. And when she raised "You're overthinking again," then came the lat. The passwords that suddenly didn't work, and Elise didn't spiral. She tracked. Not out of paranoia, but because something in her head shifted. She spotted and messages, ones carelessly left open on shared devices. Morgan's name wasn't always mentioned, but Elise started to recognize how often she showed up in his texts. She says she's free this weekend. She loved the suite. She wants Paris next. It didn't take much to connect the dots. Elise remembered the first time she confronted him. There was no drama, no shouting, no broken glass. She had simply asked, "Are you in love with her?" Julian looked up from his phone, caught off guard by the question. He gave her a half-smile. "Don't be ridiculous, E. You know I love you." But he never said no, and that was all she needed. From that moment on, she stopped waiting for apologies. She started planning. She began with the finances. She'd always kept a quiet, meticulous record of their accounts. Trusts, property deeds, equity holdings. A habit from her grad school days. Julian never questioned her access. He liked calling her his little CFO. So she used that trust against him, slowly, carefully. She began the transition, restructuring ownership, triggering clauses buried deep in their prenup, consulting lawyers, quiet ones, precise ones, experts in dismantling men like Julian without leaving behind a signature or a trace. She created new entities under her name, moved shares through silent intermediaries, rewrote board voting rights with the kind of surgical accuracy that would make Wall Street take notes. The final straw came 2 months before this flight. A receipt, a diamond necklace, purchased in Milan. Days later, Morgan had posted a photo wearing it. That's when Elise picked up the phone and called her attorney. It's time. And now, here they were, 30,000 feet in the air, and Julian still had no idea the floor beneath him was already gone. He stormed down the aisle toward her, his face tight with controlled rage. "Elise," he muttered, low and sharp, just loud enough to reach the first few rows. "What the hell did you do?" She looked up, calm, steady. "I reclaimed what I built. You're out of your mind." "No, Julian, I was out of your shadow." She paused, then added, "Now I'm back in the light." He scoffed, straightened, turned on his heel. The surrounding passengers quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't been listening. But they had. Every last one of them. Morgan avoided his gaze as he passed her. Her eyes fixed on her phone, then on her lap, searching for the next thing to post. Nothing came. Back in her seat, Elise glanced at the screen embedded in the headrest ahead of her. A flight map glowed softly, tracing their progress. They were halfway over the ocean, no turning back. Her phone buzzed once, a message from her attorney. All clear. The board's announcement had gone public 5 minutes ago. The media was already picking it up. The jet's ownership update had processed. She was in control now. "Congratulations," the message read. Elise didn't smile. Not yet. There was still turbulence ahead. She closed her eyes and leaned back, letting the hum of the engines fill the quiet space inside her. This wasn't the end, but it had begun. The next few hours would test her, every inch of her. But she had trained for this. Not with weapons, with strategy, with patience, with the quiet belief that one day she wouldn't need to whisper her worth into the mirror. She had learned to sharpen her silence into presence, to let doubt ferment into resolve. Each late night spent invisible was now currency. Every dismissive nod from a man who underestimated her was now a receipt. She would speak it aloud, and the world would hear her. The seatbelt light blinked off. A flight attendant passed, offering refills. Elise opened her eyes. "Champ," she paused, then nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "IA." The one who silenced herself for comf. That woman was gone, and in her claw. For the first time in a long, long while, Elise was ready to land wherever Morgan had always raced. She'd learned young that charm, after all, was more ab, and on that jet, slicing the lease was compo. But Morgan had seen women like her. Not with shouting, with silence. Over time, silence their cage. Morgan, still wrapped in the golden glow of ambition. She had been certain, until the pilot's voice vanished, until the recording began. The tremor that passed through, but it was real. She had felt Julian's hand clench beside he. She had watched the smug confidence drain from his face, like fine wine dumped unceremoniously down a drain. And now she sat alone, ankles crossed, hands full. But pretending? That was something Morgan had perfected long before this flight. Her affair with Julian hadn't started with seduction. Not really. It had started with recognition. She saw in him what she saw in her. A hunger to be seen, admired. Two mirrors, tilted just right to reflect power and emptiness in equal measure. Their first real conversation happened in the elevator at Bradford Tower, late one night. The offices were nearly empty. She'd been finishing data entry for an audit she wasn't technically trained to complete. He was there because of a fight with Elise, though Morgan wouldn't know that until much later. He'd asked what she was working on. She answered with something complicated, wanting to sound impressive. He didn't care. But he liked her voice, liked how it didn't crack under pressure. She was young, attractive, and untouched by the kind of wear time carves into women who've spent years standing beside powerful men. And when the elevator dinged on his floor and she hadn't stepped out yet, Julian invited her to join him for a drink. She didn't flinch, didn't look surprised. That was her move. The first night, nothing happened. Just wine, laughter, a few glances held too long. But she knew it wouldn't stop there. Julian liked to believe he was in control, but his addiction to being admired made him careless. Within a week, he was sending gifts, small at first. A coffee delivered to her desk, a sleek designer pen she never asked for. Then came the dinners, the driver waiting curbside, the last-minute business trips that just happened to include reservations for two. When she asked about Elise, he shrugged. "She knows what this life is," he said once, as if marriage were a transaction, not a vow. "She's used to it." Morgan didn't press. She didn't want to hear about Elise's sacrifices, or her years at his side helping build the empire he now flaunted. That was history. Morgan didn't care about foundations. She was chasing skylines. Over the next several months, she became Julian's shadow in private and his mystery in public. He introduced her at galas as part of acquisitions, though she'd never worked a deal in her life. He brought her into meetings, but never let her speak. She didn't need to understand the numbers. She just needed to look like his future. And she did, perfectly. Her wardrobe changed. Fast fashion gave way to designer labels. Her hair was always styled, nails manicured, glossy. She studied powerful women, mimicked their poise, their tone, their measured stillness. But there was one thing she lacked. Respect. Not that it mattered. Not then. She was on private jets. She was photographed. She was next to Julian, and Julian promised her everything. When he invited her on this anniversary trip, she knew what it meant. He was done with Elise, ready for change. He'd told her so 2 nights earlier, while they lay tangled in bed. "This trip will shift everything," he whispered, brushing her hair from her cheek. "Once we land, it'll be different." She believed him. She had to, because she had already quit her job, signed the NDA, leased a penthouse she couldn't afford alone, cut ties with old friends who warned her she was temporary. She had burned bridges for this man. But now Now she sat in a cabin where every passenger had just witnessed Elise deliver a masterstroke, cloaked in poise. And Morgan's certainty cracked. She wasn't naive. She knew the sound of a woman who hadn't been crying, who had been planning, who had been waiting. Morgan, for all her beauty, for all her studied charm, had been a pawn. Pretending to be a queen, she glanced at Julian, now standing at the front of the cabin, whispering furiously to a flight attendant. His jaw clenched, his gestures sharp. This wasn't the composed Tycho. This was a man unraveling, thread by thread. His authority no longer fit him. Like a suit one size too small, it constricted under T. And instead she opened a photo filled the screen. A self, her lips pressed to Julian's cheek, his hand resting casually on her thigh. The caption, jetting into the future, still blinking. She'd never posted it. What fueled Elise's voice echoed in her mind, not from the flight announcement, but from months ago. A company holiday party. Morgan had made awkward small talk, glowing in a designer gown she could barely afford. She'd complimented Elise's necklace, saying something trivial about pearls being timeless. Elise had smiled. Morgan hadn't. She thought Elise was just being elegant, polished. But now, those words, she did now. Across the aisle, a businessman adjusted his headphones and took growth. They weren't just witnessing a scandal. They were wreck. Allegiances where S-Power had just traded hand. Julie. We land in 2 hours, he snapped. Morgan tilted her head. He didn't answer. You said everything. He glanced at her, but not with affect, not with certainty, with P. I'll fix it, he muttered. How? Silence. He looked away, and in that second, Morgan understood something that shook her deeper than Elise's see Joel. Not one step he had always assumed the world would follow, but this wasn't a boardroom, and Elise wasn't a trophy. But the world didn't bow. And the right woman? She was 30 feet behind him. Sigh. Owning the sky. Julian thought he are. Morgan set her phone. Folded her arms. She wasn't crying, no, but the burn rising in her throat warned her. Everything she'd built was about to crumble, not hat. Her phone buzzed. A message from a stylist she used in LA. Saw the clip. Yikes, call me if you need PR? She didn't reply. 2 rows behind, someone laughed softly. She didn't turn to see who. She didn't need to. The mask had cracked, and no filter in the world could fix what was coming next. The cabin lights flickered gently as the plane began its slow descent across the vast blue stretch of the Pacific. The sun, now halfway dipped into the horizon, cast streaks of golden light through the windows, bathing the. It should have been the kind of afternoon that marked the pinnacle of an exclusive escape expense. Instead, it had a vibe. And somewhere between the fizz of champagne, the muted whispers, and the heavy Elise Bradford sat, her heart oddly still. She wasn't numb. No, she fell. Every breath, every glance. But unlike before, when emotions might have surged uncontrollably, her feelings now flowed with discipline. It was pain, yes, but no longer chaos. It was control, hard-earned and sharpened. She felt it, the way of toss. From the corn he had returned to Morgan's side, but the air around him had shifted. His pause. Morgan sat at a careful distance, her mic. The rules had changed, but only Elise knew exactly when the game had turned. It was month. Julian had canceled din. She sat alone at a rooftop restaurant, untouched risotto cooling in front of her. A quiet voice from behind. You're Elise Bradford, aren't you? The woman she introduced herself as Margaret Lane, a retired corpo. They talked, one of those rare conversations for the first time in weeks. Eventually, they touched on marriage. Power. Margaret of legal loopholes no man ever. Elise listened. She said little, but inside something flickered. That night, back at her hotel, she sent Margaret an email. And that was the first domino. The next several weeks became a quiet whirlwind beneath a perfectly polished surface. Elise began scheduling private meetings under the pretense of charity work. She sat with advisors, attorneys, and financial strategists. She pulled out their prenuptial agreement, an outdated document drawn up at Julian's insistence early in their marriage, written with the assumption that Elise would remain forever in the role of wife and mother. But Elise had grown. She had studied contracts, studied corporate law, sat through every board meeting Julian once dominated, and watched how men dressed up manipulation as charisma. Now, aboard this jet, she was the only one not scrambling. The man seated next to her, an older gentleman in a gray blazer, leaned in slightly. Was that really you on the announcement? He asked, voice low. Elise turned to him. composed and steady. "Yes," she replied. He blinked. His lips formed a small O, then he nodded slowly. "Damn." She offered a polite nod, then turned her gaze back to the window. Outside, the clouds stretched below like an endless sea, vast, indifferent. Just like power. Up front, Morgan stood and made her way toward the lavatory. She paused beside a flight attendant and said something. The words were lost in the cabin noise, but the gestures weren't. She pointed toward Elise, spoke sharply. The attendant didn't flinch. Instead, she handed Morgan a sealed envelope and gestured subtly toward the cockpit. Morgan looked confused, but took it. Elise knew what it was. A message. Part of the next phase. While Julian flailed to contain the wreckage, Elise had planned every move like clockwork. The announcement had only been the prologue. There was still the press release, the formal board resolution, the media leak, timed precisely to match their dissent. All of it orchestrated, not for spectacle, but for control. She thought of the nights spent in quiet solitude, her study lit only by a desk lamp, spreadsheets glowing across the screen while Julian claimed he was working late. The fake smiles at corporate events where she played the perfect wife, even as Morgan hovered nearby, like a scent that overstayed its welcome. She remembered hushed meetings in quiet cafes, lawyers warning her, "Once you light this match, there's no turning back." She'd nodded. She had never planned on revenge. She wanted respect. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime. The intercom came to life again, but this time it was the pilot's voice, yet not as rehearsed or confident as before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we apologize for the earlier disruption. At this time, we'd like to share a message on behalf of Mrs. Bradford, approved by the Board of Directors of Bradford International Holdings." There it was. Layer 2. Passengers shifted. Phones reappeared. Someone 3 rows up hit record. The cabin screen above seat 1A flickered to life. First the Bradford logo, then a crisp video. Elise, seated in a modern office, professionally dressed, poised. It had been recorded 3 days earlier. "Good afternoon," she began. "For years, Bradford International has stood as a symbol of excellence and innovation. But let's be clear, that success was never built by one man, despite what headlines may suggest. It was built by a team, by partnerships, and by those who understood that loyalty must go both ways." She paused, letting the words land. "In recent months," she continued, "actions have been taken that violate our company's core ethics, our mission, and the trust of our shareholders. These actions were not approved by the board. They do not reflect who we are." Julian collapsed further into his seat. His face had gone pale. Morgan stared at the screen, blinking rapidly. "As of today," Elise said, "the board has voted to restructure the company's leadership and operations. We will issue an official statement upon landing. But let me be perfectly clear. We will no longer tolerate the exploitation of personal ambition disguised as leadership." "Not anymore." The screen faded to black. Silence. Then a few quiet claps, scattered, respectful. Not the applause of excitement, but the acknowledgement of a truth long overdue. A woman near the back even whispered, "Finally." Elise didn't turn. She simply adjusted her watch. Almost there. Morgan emerged from the lavatory moments later, not from grief, but from panic. From the sinking realization that she moved down the aisle like a woman walking through a downpour without an umbrella. Julian didn't speak, his jaw locked, his fists clenched. But rage woo, not here. Not at 35,000 feet, where there was no one left to deceive the game. And he wasn't holding the board anymore. Elise leaned back, her head resting gently ag. She stared out the wide at the clouds drifting with the quiet power of a woman who... There was no victory parade, no, and there was still more, too. The jet cruised through the final the cabin. It was the silence that follows chaos, the kind that lingers in the V, revealing a completely changed landscape. This wasn't a battlefield, but the devastation was no less complete. Julian hadn't said a word since. His breath came in short, clipped inhales, as if he was trying to breathe. He leaned slightly forward, one hand gripping the armrest so beside him, as if the right sentence might undo everything, as if image could still salvage identity, trying to draft a version of the story where she looked clean, where she didn't seem like the disposable accessory she had always feared she might be. But the Wi-Fi flickered. Nothing would send. The signal wouldn't cooperate. Neither would reality. And Elise? She remained as she had the entire flight, still, But in her case, stillness wasn't surrender. It was command. Elise wasn't reading. She wasn't typing. She didn't even pretend to sleep. She sat upright, one leg crossed neatly over the other, fingers resting lightly along the edge of her tray, eyes fixed on the sky outside as it shifted from gold to dusky blue, afternoon fading into evening. Every now and then, she would reach for her glass, sip slowly, with a grace that no longer felt performative. She wasn't trying to play the role of the poised wife anymore. She was. A woman seated a few rows behind, beside a teenage daughter, leaned in and whispered something. The girl turned, looked directly at Elise. She didn't smile, but in her gaze, there was something else. Recognition. Respect. Elise held her eyes for just a moment, then turned away. That was enough. This wasn't theater. It didn't need applause. What she had done wasn't a performance. It was a transformation. Near the cockpit, a crew member emerged carrying a tray of refreshments. The mood on board now resembled a courtroom. Soft voices, controlled gestures, and the heavy silence that follows a verdict. Everyone was quietly choosing sides. Julian had never known this position before. He had entered every room like he owned it. And if he didn't, he bought it or bulldozed it. But now, on a jet that had once been his, the balance of power had flipped so completely, so swiftly, that he seemed adrift. Finally, he turned to Morgan and whispered, "You need to say something. Post something. Control the narrative." Morgan looked up, stunned. "Say what exactly? That I was having an affair with a married man who just lost his company in front of 20 witnesses?" Julian's jaw tightened. "You're not the villain here. I'm not the wife either," she snapped. "You're the woman," he started. "I care about you. You cared about her first," Morgan cut in, nodding toward Elise. "You still wear the watch she gave you. You took her jet on our trip. You married her. You built all of this with her, and now you're shocked she took it back?" She paused. "Maybe you don't know her as well as you think." Julian didn't respond. He leaned back, closed his eyes, then opened them again. Sharply awake, he pulled out his phone and dialed. No connection. He tried again. Signal failed. Again. Nothing. Abruptly, he stood and walked toward the back of the aircraft. He ignored the glances that followed him as he stepped into the narrow galley corridor. He leaned against the wall, muttering a quiet string of curses. The weight of his new reality pressed down hard. There was no fixing this with a press release or a wire transfer. This wasn't a PR disaster. It was a hostile takeover. Only instead of a boardroom coup, it had unfolded mid-air, mid-marriage, mid-denial. The seatbelt light clicked on again, accompanied by a soft chime. The co-pilot's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our initial descent shortly. Please return to your seats and secure all personal items." Standard script. But now, it sounded like the closing statement of a trial. Julian returned to his seat, silent. He looked out the window like a man searching for something, anything to anchor himself to. But all he saw was sky, and far beneath them, the gray outline of land creeping into view, signaling not just the end of a flight, but the start of consequences. Elise reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded slip of paper. No drama. She didn't unfold it slowly or read aloud, just glanced at it, nodded once, then slid it back into her purse. The final checklist. New board structure. Attorneys waiting on the ground. Press staged for official statements. Every minute accounted for. Every reaction mapped in advance. The pilot's voice returned. Estimated time to landing, 31 minutes. Weather at destination is clear, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. We hope you've enjoyed your flight. The irony nearly made Elise laugh. She hadn't enjoyed the flight, but she'd survived it. And she was the only one still in control. Behind her, a couple whispered, this time not even trying to be discreet. "That's the guy who ditched his wife mid-anniversary to sit with his mistress," the woman said, her tone sharp with the kind of judgment only another woman could deliver. "Well," the husband replied, deadpan, "karma flies first class too." Morgan sank deeper into her seat. She no longer looked like the polished accomplice. She looked like a woman realizing she'd boarded the wrong flight entirely. There would be no glowing headlines this time, no gossip columns praising her outfit. If she was mentioned at all, it would be as a footnote. The younger woman, name withheld. Julian, for all his bravado, finally began to crumble. His shoulders slumped, his gaze dropped, the weight of it all settling into his frame. This wasn't just humiliation, it was loss. And a man like him, who had always held the power, didn't know how to carry that. Elise saw it. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She just watched, calm, quiet. As Julian finally understood what she had known for months, the world he built, it only stood so long as she held it up. And the moment she let go, it all came crashing down. It collapsed. The landing gear unfolded with a metallic clunk. The cabin shifted slightly as the jet tilted into its descent, seatbacks upright, tray tables locked, phones off airplane mode. Everyone was preparing to land. But Elise, she was preparing to arrive. That difference meant everything. The wheels struck the tarmac with a jarring thud, a sudden jolt that shattered the pressure in the cabin like a pin bursting a balloon. Bodies shifted instinctively, but no one spoke. Through the oval windows, a private hangar came into view. Its glass and steel gleaming in the amber of late-day sun. The exterior was peaceful, even beautiful. But inside the cabin, emotions churned in a tense, wordless silence, the kind that follows verdicts or funerals. Julian sat motionless, jaw clenched, staring forward. Morgan clutched her handbag with both hands, her shoulders rigid, eyes locked on the front, willing herself invisible. Her knuckles were white against the soft leather of the strap, like someone bracing for impact she already knew was coming. Elise, by contrast, sat in stillness, not cold, but composed. There was warmth in her presence, but not the kind born of affection. It was the warmth of a hearth that no longer needed to invite anyone in. The warmth came from assurance, from clarity. She didn't look victorious. She looked complete, as if something within her had finally clicked into place, not with joy, but with quiet finality. The aircraft coasted gently to a stop, wheels humming along the concrete until it reached the private jets. A fleet of black SUVs waited near the building, along with a small group of impeccably dressed professionals, clipboards in hand, murmuring into Bluetooth earpieces. The Bradford International logo gleamed on two of the vehicles. Everything was just like Elise's entire plan. No chaos, no ski. Every move accounted for before the jet ever left the runway. She had envisioned this moment, not a soft chime in no-on. The silence held, punctuated only by the whisper of air through the vents and the soft rustle of someone reaching into the overhead compartment. Then the flight attendants moved. Smiles voices polite, directing passengers. It was meant to feel ordinary, but nothing about it. Julian stood first. He adjusted the queue, pulled down his jacket and wall. He didn't glance at Ellis, didn't speak to Morg. The man who had once owned every room now walked through it like a visitor in someone else's narrative. His foe. He reached the stairs. The door opened. A rush of warm coastal air swept through, brushing against him like a truth he could no longer outrun. He stepped onto the tarmac, toward the waiting SUV. But the driver didn't move. No one opened the door for him. They simply stood, waiting for someone else. That someone was still seated calmly at the rear of the aircraft. Morgan rose slowly, hesitant. She gathered her coat, adjusted her sunglasses, even though the sun was already dipping low behind the hangar. Then followed Julian. 3 paces behind. She glanced back once, reflexively, but when she saw Elise still composed, still unmoved in her seat, she looked away quickly. There was shame in her eyes now, quiet but unmistakable. Not just for what had happened aboard the flight, but for everything she had wagered on a man who'd never once hesitated to use her, discard her, and set her up for a fall far steeper than anything he himself would ever endure. Outside, a camera shutter clicked. Then another. There weren't many reporters. Elise had made sure of that. But there were enough to capture the transition, to record the moment power moved from assumption to intent in crisp, high-resolution frames that would be online within the hour. Julian saw them. He paused, glanced toward the hangar, then looked down. No press conference, no statement, just silence. And then Elise stood. She adjusted her blazer, reached for her handbag, and walked down the aisle. Each row she passed, passengers leaned subtly away, out of respect, or maybe awe. No one spoke. A few nodded. One woman whispered, "Good for her," to her husband, who nodded silently in return. When Elise reached the exit, she didn't hesitate. She descended the stairs with calm, deliberate grace. The coastal breeze tugged gently at the hem of her blazer. On the tarmac, a sharply dressed executive stepped forward. Her new chief of legal. He extended a leather folder toward her. "All signed," he said, his voice low. "Transfers complete. Press is already picking it up." "Thank you, Martin." Elise replied evenly. The board? They've issued statements to all key stakeholders. She nodded, then turned to face the fleet of SUVs. One driver stepped forward, held open a door. For her. Not for Julian. Not for Morgan. Just her. She stepped in without hesitation, but not before one final glance. Back toward Julian. He was watching her. Of course he was. His expression hollow, the look of a man who had run out of lines in a play he thought he wrote. No plea, no rage, not even sorrow. Just emptiness. As if he finally understood, he was not the hero, not the villain, just a subplot. Inside the SUV, Elise pulled the door closed behind her. The world outside faded beneath the soft thud of muted glass. Martin spoke into a headset up front. The driver adjusted the airflow. The temperature was perfect. Elise didn't look at Julian or Morgan. She looked ahead, toward the horizon, toward the sky. She had crossed the line, with nothing but a voice and a plan. Moments later, the SUV pulled away from the tarmac. Others followed. In the rearview mirror, Elise caught a final glimpse of Julian. Still standing there, surrounded by silence, and a version of his life that no longer belonged to him. Then she turned away. They drove through a side gate of the private terminal, bypassing the main entrance entirely. Inside her purse, her phone buzzed again. A cascade of notifications lit up the screen. News alerts, stock updates, emails from reporters. She didn't read them. Not yet. She would later. She had time now. Elise leaned her head back against the smooth leather, closed her eyes, and released a slow, steady breath. No chaos stirred within her. No panic, no regret. Just clarity. It wasn't relief. It was reclamation. A moment so still, so precise, it felt sacred. Her assistant would already be at the hotel, with the finalized paperwork waiting. There would be a stakeholder call with London that evening. And later, a charity gala. Only now she wouldn't be attending as someone's guest. She would be the keynote speaker. Next month? The launch of her own initiative, focused on ethical corporate leadership and mentoring women in business. She had plans. None of them included piecing together a man who only knew how to break. Back on the jet, Morgan looked at Julian. Rez, are you going to say anything? And maybe for the first time, that was. Because sometimes words done, they only show how long it took. In that pause, filled only with the L. The skyline shimmered outside the high dusky gold bathed the city. Its reflection danced as she stow, no longer dressed for battle. The fight was over. And now, in its aft, a new weight settled in. Not the burden of exhaustion, but the quiet, unfamiliar density of victory. Everything she had once dared to imagine, alone, in silence, night after night, had unfolded in front of strange 30,000 feet above the ocean. And it had landed. Perfectly. The headlines were just begin. The board had released their statement. The legal transfers were certified. Julie, the jet, the comms T, the corporate account, all reassigned, all sealed. All. She took another sip of water. The suite behind her remained still. Her assistant had left 20 minutes earlier, promising to return in the morning with a final press schedule and an updated itinerary. Elise had barely spoken since stepping out of the SUV. She hadn't needed to. Her presence was enough. She didn't need to speak. Not yet. And honestly, she hadn't decided if she wanted to. The silence now wasn't hollow. It was earned. It was the kind of silence that followed the reclaiming of something that had once been hers and had never truly left her. Across the suite, her phone lit up again. Buzzing. More alerts. Messages from former colleagues. Congratulations from board members. Even a few hesitant voicemails from mutual acquaintances, unsure now where their loyalties should lie. She let them sit. They weren't urgent. They weren't necessary. Because this story, it had never been about them. It was hers. Elise lowered herself gently onto the edge of the sofa, setting the glass of water down on the coffee table. She exhaled. Not a sigh, a release. Her body ached, not from effort, but from holding herself together for too long. Finally, she allowed herself to unfold. She untied her hair from the knot it had been in for hours, ran her fingers along the back of her neck, leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. For a moment, the full weight of the day pressed down. But it didn't crush her. She'd carried heavier. The years had forged resilience in places no one could see. Early sacrifices, sleepless nights, coaching Julian through missteps and disappointments, only to watch him wear success like a tailored suit, never acknowledging the seamstress. She'd once believed it was all part of partnership. that their bond meant more than the validation he sought from the spotlight. But the light had always favored him, and when it finally shifted, it burned. A soft knock tapped at the suite door, polite, almost unsure. Elise rose, calm, not startled. She crossed the room, checked the monitor, old habits, and opened the door. A hotel staffer stood outside, arms full of neatly wrapped parcels. "Delivery from Mrs. Bradford," he said respectfully, "from various senders. Flowers, letters, documents." She stepped aside. "Thank you." He placed the items gently onto the entry table. "Anything else you need tonight, ma'am?" She gave a brief, composed smile. "No, thank you." He left quietly. She locked the door behind him, then stood for a moment, simply staring at the gifts. An opulent floral arrangement came from a law firm she hadn't worked with in over a decade. Another box bore the logo of a luxury brand Julian had once failed to partner with. The letters, folded neatly in gold-trimmed envelopes, bore the signatures of many hands. Some offered support. Some asked for access, introductions, opportunities. She didn't open them. Not yet. Not out of dismissal, but because she already knew what they would say. Power attracts. It always had, but it was one small envelope, no return address. That caught her attention. She reached for it, broke the seal, unfolded the single sheet inside. No signature, no sender, just one typed sentence at the center. "Not every woman has the courage to land the plane. You did." She read it once, then again, a third time, and slowly a smile came. Not triumphant, just knowing. She set the note down, returned to the sofa, lifted her glass. Downstairs, in a much smaller, far less elegant suite, Julian sat slumped in an armchair that didn't fit him. The lighting was dim, just a lone floor lamp casting long, empty shadows. Scattered across the room, missed calls, unread messages, news alerts from publications he once had on speed dial. Now, they weren't answering, they were writing. About him. Photos of him stepping off the jet, defeated. Flanked by a mistress whose name the press hadn't printed yet, but whose image had already flooded every timeline. No one spun it in his favor. Not one headline, no redemption arc, no sympathy, just variations of the same cold truth. Westwood Empire falls mid-flight. He reached for a whiskey bottle, unscrewed the cap, drank from it. No glass, no ice, no performance, just reality. Lana? Gone. Not gone, but not there. She'd checked into a different hotel under a different name. She hadn't answered his last 3 texts. Her silence wasn't like Elise's. Elise's silence weighed. Lana's? It was just absence. And Julian didn't know which felt worse. He replayed the moment in his head. Elise's voice through the cabin speakers. Composed, elegant, immovable. She hadn't just exposed him, she'd reset the stage, not as a wife betrayed, but as a CEO. As a woman who built the kingdom while he pretended to rule it. She didn't scream, she didn't plead, she didn't even face him. She just erased him, like a bad line of code patched out in one clean update. And now? Here he was. In a borrowed suit, in a downgraded room. No press team, no plane, no narrative. Just a man with a name, and nothing left beneath it. In another corner of the city, Elise stepped out onto her suite's balcony. The night air was cool, gentle, brushing against her skin like a promise. The skyline shimmered in the dark, a constellation of man-made light. Once, it had meant power, prestige. Now, it looked delicate. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, not thinking of the flight, but of the journey, of the years, the compromises, the dismissals, the quiet cuts and overlooked bruises. Dinner parties where she was Julian's wife, never Elise. Boardrooms where her strategies became someone else's credit. The expectation to smile, to stay composed, to be silent, even when silence hurt. All of that had brought her here. But none of it defined her. The silence she endured, it was gone now, and in its place, something new, something hers. This silence, the silence she had designed, was peace. The next morning arrived quietly, no dramatic light spilling through the windows, no cinematic thunder rumbling in the distance. Just a soft, endless gray sky hanging over the city, as if even the clouds were holding their breath. Elise woke early, not from anxiety, not from pressure, but because she'd trained herself to meet days like this with focus, not frenzy. She moved through her routine in silence, cool water on her face, a navy blue tailored suit, a single gold pin at her lapel, her hair swept into a sleek chignon. Her heels echoed faintly as she crossed the suite floor toward the mirror. She paused, not to admire her reflection, but to align it. This wasn't about vanity, it was about readiness. And today, required nothing less. Downstairs, her driver waited, standing by the sleek black sedan that had effectively become her mobile office for the past 6 months. As she stepped inside, she gave a quiet nod to Morgan, already seated in the back, a tablet resting on his knee. "The board is assembled," he said without preamble. "We begin in 40. Press is circling, but access is locked down." Elise nodded, eyes watching the blur of the city through tinted glass. "What's the sentiment?" "Overwhelming support," he replied, "but some confusion. They want to know what comes next." She gave a faint, unsmiling curve of her lips. "That's why I'm here." The Bradford Holdings Tower rose above the skyline like a monument to ambition. 47 floors of glass and steel. Once imagined by an architect, Julian had flown in from Berlin because he liked the aesthetic. He demanded the curved silhouette, the 360-degree boardroom view. It had once struck Elise as indulgent. Now, it felt poetic. They entered through the executive entrance, avoiding the lobby, where press waited behind velvet barriers. Security ushered them swiftly to a private elevator. Within seconds, they were rising. Morgan scanned his notes, but Elise said nothing. There was no need to rehearse. Every word she was about to deliver had been crafted and refined in her mind for months, not as a speech, as a blueprint. When the elevator doors opened, the top floor welcomed her with cool elegance. Dark wood panels, soft lighting, and the low hum of powerful people preparing to talk about other powerful people. The boardroom door stood open. Inside, a long pane of glass masquerading as a table reflected the skyline of Chicago. Around it sat 12 board members, men and women Elise once served coffee to in her earliest days. Back then, they'd smiled politely, assumed she was the executive wife who'd nod, listen, then exit quietly. Now, they stood when she entered. They didn't have to, but they did. "Good morning," Elise said, walking to the head of the table. "Good morning, Miss Bradford," replied the chairman, a man named Grant Holloway. His allegiance had once leaned heavily toward Julian. His voice was neutral, but his gaze, curious, laced with a respect he hadn't shown before. Elise took her seat, folded her hands on the polished table. "Let's begin." The next hour unfolded like a chess match. But Elise made every move with calculated control. She walked them through the transition of leadership, not just a legal shift, but a shift in values. She addressed the blind spots of the past, Julian's excess, the mismanagement, the ethical erosion. She didn't attack him by name, but she didn't protect him either. She laid out facts, numbers, trends. Every slide Morgan projected reinforced her narrative with hard evidence and strategic vision. No sentiment, just conviction. Midway through, one board member cautiously raised a hand. "And Julian," she asked, "will there be a statement, or some form of retirement?" Elise held the moment, then replied, "There will be no statement, no tribute. He made his decisions, we're making ours." A beat of silence, then nods. The vote was called, unanimous. Elise Bradford, now CEO of Bradford Holdings. As the meeting closed, board members approached, offering handshakes, reserved congratulations, measured admiration. Some lingered longer. One leaned in and whispered, "I always figured you were sharper than you let on." Elise didn't correct him. She simply smiled and walked on. Back in her private office, a space she had quietly redesigned weeks ago, in preparation, she sat at the walnut desk, stared out at the skyline, no longer a symbol of someone else's empire, now her own. Morgan stepped in, a tray with black coffee and a manila folder. "From legal," he said. "Final confirmation, Julian's access is entirely revoked. No longer a signatory, no travel privileges." Elise nodded, accepted the folder, set it aside. "And Lana?" she asked. "Publicly quiet," Morgan replied. "Privately, her agent's shopping her around for interviews. We've issued gag orders to all corporate affiliates. If she spoke, she'd forfeit her rights to the brand's likeness clauses. She'd lose control of the narrative." "She'll go silent," Morgan said, then paused. "There's one more thing. Julian called this morning, left a voicemail. He says he wants to speak with you, just you." Elise looked up slowly. "Did he say why?" "No." She turned back to the window, the skyline casting long shadows across the floor, her thoughts hovering somewhere between glass and sky. "I won't call him back," she said quietly. "He's not part of this chapter." Morgan nodded, took the tray, and stepped out. She sat alone for several long minutes, letting the silence take shape around her. It wasn't empty, it was earned. The kind of quiet that doesn't come when noise dies, but when it's no longer necessary. She glanced around the office, minimalist, intentional. The art? Chosen by her. No photos from the past, nothing from the life that had ended at 37,000 feet. Then, she turned to her laptop, opened a blank document, and began typing. It wasn't a memo or a press draft, it was a letter to herself, a record of what it cost to stand here and why she'd never pay that price again. Because this silence, it wasn't an ending, it was a foundation. Later, as dusk crept over the city, Elise walked the edge of the rooftop garden atop Bradford Holdings Tower, a private space, redesigned at her direction, for reflection, for solitude, for truth. Below, the city pulsed with urgency, taxis, footsteps, late-night meetings. But up here, stillness. The air was tinged with late summer jasmine. She paused, fingers resting on the cool stone rail, eyes on the lit-up office floors across the skyline. Inside those floors, her company, no longer Julian's, rebalanced, refocused, reclaimed. Her phone buzzed again. The screen lit up. Julian. Fourth time that week. No voicemail, just the stubborn ring of someone who hadn't yet realized silence could be permanent. She let it ring. When it stopped, she exhaled, turned toward the table where a leather folder sat waiting. Inside, initiatives, forecasts, partnerships, her future. But her past was still trying to interrupt. 30 minutes passed. She hadn't moved until Morgan returned, not her assistant anymore. Her chief strategy officer, promoted officially that morning. He knew her rhythms, he knew her silences. He's downstairs, he said. Security called. He's not making a scene. Just asked to see you. Elise didn't turn. Did he say why? Morgan hesitated. Said it was personal. Said he won't leave until you do. If she spoke, she'd forfeit, she'd lose control of the narrative. S then paused. There's one Mo Julian called this morning, left at Gogthpa. He says he wants to speak with you. Just you. Elise looked up, slowly. Did he say why? No. She turned back to the window, the skyline casting long shadows across the floor, her thoughts hovering. I won't call him back, she said quietly. He's not part of this chapter. The kind of resolve that doesn't just come from pain, but from having Morgan nodded, took the tray, and stepped out. She sat alone for several long minutes, letting the silence take strength. It wasn't empty, it was earned. The kind of quiet that doesn't come when noise dies, but when it's no longer necessary. She glanced around the office. Minimalist, intentional. The art, chosen by her. No photos from the nothing from the life, every detail of then. She turned to her laptop, opened a blank document, and began typing. It wasn't a memo or a press draft. It was a letter to herself. A record. And why she'd never pay that price again. Because this silence, it was a foundation. A ground she had built beneath her later. As dusk crept over the city, Elise walked through a private space, redesigned at her direction, for reflection, for solitude, for truth. Below, the city pulsed with urgency, taxis, foots, late-night meetings. But up here, stillness. The air was tinged with late summer. She paused, fingers resting, eyes on the lit-up office floors across the skyline. Inside those floors, her company, no longer Julian's, rebalanced, refocused, reclaimed. Her foe again. The screen lit up. Julian. Fourth. No voicemail, just the stubborn ring of someone who hadn't yet realized. Silence. She let it ring. When it stopped, she exhaled, turned toward the table where a leather folder sat waiting. Initiatives, forecasts, partners. Her future, but her past was still trying to interrupt, and she could fee. 30 minutes she hadn't moved. You not her assistant anymore. Her chief strategy officer, promoted official. He knew her rhythms. He knew he's say. He's not making it just as Elise de Morgan hesitated, said it was personal. Said he won't leave until you do. And what do you expect me to do with that? Elise's voice didn't rise, didn't falter. Forgive it? Wrap it in a neat little story where you're the man who learned too late? Julian's voice caught. No, he said quietly, almost pleading. I don't expect forgiveness. I didn't want to disappear without saying something real. Real? She repeated softly but sharp. Real would have been telling me the truth before the flight. Real would have meant not lying to the world about who we were. He looked at her then. Fully. No shields, no deflection. You were the best part of my life, he said, and I never deserved you. Elise's jaw tightened. But she didn't look away. You're right, she said. You didn't. And for a long time I thought that was my fault, that maybe I wasn't enough, that I hadn't done enough. But it was never about what I lacked, Julian. It was about what you couldn't give. He nodded. Slowly. the weight of it all finally anchoring itself into his posture. I never thought it would end like this. It didn't have to. He turned, staring at the skyline he once called his. She left, he said suddenly. Lana, 2 days ago. Said she didn't want to be a footnote in someone else's scandal. Said she never really knew me. She was right. Elise didn't flinch. Then maybe, she said, you'll take the time to know yourself. He let out a breath. Not quite a laugh, but something bitter. I don't know if there's anything worth knowing anymore. There is. Her voice was softer now, but it's not in what you've built. It's in what you're willing to let fall. Julian blinked, as if her words struck somewhere deep, somewhere unprepared. I won't bother you again, he said. I know. He looked at his hands, then back to her. One last thing, he said. Thank you for seeing me. She didn't say you're welcome. She didn't say goodbye. She just gave a single, precise nod. He turned, walked back to the elevator, his steps muted, and he didn't look back when the doors closed. Elise turned back to the railing, picked up the folder she'd left earlier, and looked out as the sky shifted from blue to violet. Evening settling. The garden was quiet again, but it wasn't the quiet of regret or abandonment. It was the silence after the last conversation, when there was nothing left to say, only peace. Now her image graced the covers of global finance magazines, Leaders More. Instead, she focused on what mattered, using her platform to shape what came next, not to explain what she had done. On a warm Friday morning, Elise entered the auditorium at the Bradford Foundation. The backstage, Morgan adjusted his tie, eyes glued to the notes on, and Elise gave a small wry smile. Tell security's tight, he added. Media is screened. Everyone cleared. I'm not worried, she replied, Her words weren't bravado. They were a truth earn. Morgan gave a short chew. She closed, letting the old voices surface. Fear of judgment, fear of ambition being called, but they no longer held her hose. And then, like a wave that never reached the shore, she let them recede. When she stepped on to the stage, the lights didn't blind, they welcomed. The applause swelled, not thunderous but full of something real. It wasn't the sound of fame, it was the sound of recognition. She reached the podium. No notes, no teleprompter, just her. 3 weeks ago, she began, her voice strong and sure. I made a choice. Some called it bold, others strategic, a few said theatrical. She paused, but for me, it wasn't about spectacle. It was about reclaiming a narrative that never truly belonged to me, Elise said, letting the words sit in the room for a heartbeat. For years, I watched decisions happen in rooms I was allowed to decorate, but never influence. I was praised for being supportive, for being silent, for knowing my place in the background. But silence isn't always grace, she continued, her voice steady. Sometimes silence is erasure. A low murmur of recognition rippled through the auditorium. And sometimes, she added, pausing with a small knowing smile, the only way to be heard is to speak, at a moment no one expects. Mid-flight, for example, there were chuckles now. Soft but genuine. Not laughter at her expense, but a collective understanding. Elise pressed on. That moment didn't define me. What I did next did. I didn't retaliate. I didn't fall apart. I redirected. I remembered who I was before I was ever introduced as someone's plus one. She stepped from the podium and moved slowly across the stage, letting the rhythm of her steps match her message. The Ascend initiative isn't about revenge. It's not even about recovery. It's about recognition, about lifting the voices that have waited too long to rise, about giving power to those who were told to soften, to wait, to dim. She gestured toward the front row, toward the young women watching her with wide, hopeful eyes. You don't need to wait for your seat at the table. You can build the table, own the room, and if someone tries to take your voice, there's always another way to speak. The applause that followed was fuller, firmer. She didn't wave or gesture for more. She just stood, anchored, while the sound confirmed what she already knew. She had become something more than the scandal, more than the story. She had become proof. After the event, in the green room, a journalist approached, recorder in hand. You said this wasn't about revenge, she began. But is there satisfaction, knowing the world saw what he did? Elise gave a small, thoughtful tilt of her head. Satisfaction is a byproduct, she said. Purpose is the point. That evening, Elise sat alone in her apartment, a space she had chosen not far from the home she once shared with Julian. She didn't want the mansion. Too much space. Too many ghosts. This new place was full of light, clean, open, with a balcony overlooking the river. She curled up with a book, a mug of peppermint tea, and the soft hum of Billie Holiday from her speakers. Her phone buzzed. Another message from a VC firm, eager to invest millions in her initiative. She didn't rush to answer. She had time now. Outside, the city moved fast and impatient. But Elise no longer moved at its pace. Somewhere out there, she knew Julian might still be watching, maybe scrolling through news clips, maybe remembering who he used to be, maybe trying to find another spotlight to stand in. But she didn't think of him often. And when she did, it felt like looking at an old painting once cherished, now just decoration, something that no longer mattered. She didn't need revenge. She had resolution. As the jazz played on, and the city's lights blinked like a quiet constellation, Elise leaned back and let the moment fully land. She had walked away. She had not just survived, she had ascended. So the story is over. Our wonderful friends, are you still here at this hour? If you are, then something in this journey has reached into your chest and gently tugged at your heart. And maybe now, just like Elise did, we look at it not with fear, but with clarity. This wasn't just a story about revenge or business, it was about becoming. About how life sometimes pushes us so far into silence that the only way out is to speak. Not with volume, but with truth. Elise didn't win because she shouted louder. She won because she finally stopped waiting for permission to take up space. Maybe you felt that too, the ache of invisibility, the heaviness of compromise. But healing often begins not in the big moments, but in the quiet ones. As Rumi once said, the wound is the place where the light enters you. This story reminds us that even the most devastating betrayals can become the very soil where your next chapter grows. Elise's strength wasn't perfection, it was presence. She didn't become someone else. She remembered who she had always been, buried beneath years of sacrifice. And when she stepped back into her power, she didn't ask the world to applaud. She simply moved forward, and the world followed. So, if you're here right now, still listening, it means you're ready to reclaim something too. Your time, your voice, your worth. And if this story stirred something in you, let it. Let it be the sign you didn't know you were waiting for. Share this video with someone who might need it, like it if it moved you. And subscribe, because there are more stories coming, stories that remind us we are not alone in our quietest battles. Because healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply whispers, you are more than what broke you.